Elon Musk's Boring Company first proposed the Vegas Loop, the Tesla tunnels, as a people mover at the convention center. But with the help of the powerful Las Vegas Convention and Visitors Authority, the project is now expanding across 68 miles of our city. Should it? Today on CityCast Las Vegas, we share the product of a year-long investigation into the Boring Company, co-authored by journalist Daniel Rothberg and my co-host David Figler for ProPublica. The team looked into how the Boring Company has skirted regulations and received fines for environmental and labor incidents, but still managed to win approvals from multiple layers of local government. This is big. It's Wednesday, January 8th. I'm Sarah Lohman, and here's what Las Vegas is talking about. All right, Daniel, what are some of the substantive finds of this report? Can you summarize for us?
Yeah, so what we found is that the Boring Company was approved by the Las Vegas Convention and Visitors Authority, the Clark County Commission, and the Las Vegas City Council with very minimal public input. Unlike a lot of transit projects, there wasn't a big environmental impact statement done because the Boring Company is a private company and doesn't receive federal funding. There wasn't a lot of analysis of what the potential alternatives were for a transit system. And that's especially a big deal because what we found is that they were approved over time in sort of a piecemeal fashion to build about 68 miles of tunnel. Which is huge for the valley, right?
That really surprised me. I mean, I knew that they were looking at going to the airport, but when I looked at the map in this article, it's like airport all the way down the strip to Fremont Street.
Right. It would go all the way to City Hall. You know, it's a much larger scope than people realize. And I believe Boring says on its website that they are approved to build 104 stations, which is just, if you think about that, Las Vegas doesn't really have mass transit. As we would think about light rail or something like that. And so for this to be approved with little public input, little scrutiny of the details of the construction, the maintenance, the operations, I think was a pretty significant and core find in our story.
David, how did this story come on your radar, and how did this ProPublica collaboration happen?
It's funny. I know you said what were the significant findings of the story, but I heard in my ear what were the significant finds. Yeah, and and there are so many of them, and they haven't really been reported. And that to me was kind of how this all started. So, I mean, hats off. We on CityCast here did a story early on about an OSHA violation. There were some workplace violations that were cited, and there was a fine of about, $100,000 or something like that levied against the Boring Company for the way that workers were exposed to some toxic chemicals. And, that kind of got my mind rolling. Like, why didn't we hear about that months ago? Why are we waiting for national media to be catching the story, which, basically was like 7 or 8 months later? And then we found out here at CityCast that there was some storage of wet materials, wet dirt. We don't know to this day what was in it, but it was at the commercial center in the middle of the city off of Sahara. And so it was like we reported on that, and that just kept leading to more and more discoveries about incidents and fines and violations, none of which are being reported in the media. And so we just started doing some deep diving. And while we were doing public record requests, we found that the story just was a little bit bigger and probably needed a collaboration with someone like Daniel Rothberg. And then together we wound up with ProPublica, who is very interested in these impact stories, especially as Las Vegas is being looked at by other cities to see if this kind of system not only is useful, but if it really works well for the community.
Right. I have so many questions. Go ahead, Daniel.
I just, to add on to David's point, I want to go through some of the fines and violations because I think they paint a picture of the nature of the oversight and regulation for this project, which has been kind of distributed among a lot of different agencies, state and local agencies.
Yeah, please. And I just want to clarify that these are fines and violations that are not just like affecting the workers, but it's all Las Vegans, correct?
Yeah, I mean, traffic violations, water violations, transport violations, doing work without permitting. It's all documented, and, the government officials all know about it. I think to Daniel's point, there's sort of a siloing of different agencies that are responsible for different parts of oversight, and they don't necessarily talk to each other. So we were able to cumulatively put it all together, basically aggregate what's going on. And I think we discovered stuff that maybe one government agency doesn't know about happenings at another government agency, which was also very interesting.
All right, so let's get into the laundry list of fines and violations in just a moment, because I also want to emphasize that this was not the first city that Musk came to with this project, right? He first started with Los Angeles, and then there were a couple other cities. Can you tell me briefly why in Las Vegas, but why these other cities passed?
Yeah, so the Boring Companies looked at a lot of different states and cities. They've looked at Chicago, they've looked at Maryland, and they've also looked to Los Angeles. And in all of these places, there were requirements to do comprehensive environmental reviews. There were a lot of questions. There's a lot of civic engagement. There were, a lot of questions from the community, from groups, from local officials about whether this made the most sense, what the opportunity costs were, what the environmental impacts were, and what was sort of on the line for taxpayers. The projects fizzled out in most other places, and they came to Las Vegas through the Las Vegas Convention and Visitors Authority, the LVCVA. And they bid on a request for proposal from the LVCVA to build a people mover in the convention center. At the time that they pitched that, though, their sights were on something much larger, on a much more expansive project throughout the Las Vegas Valley, connecting the airport. Potentially, we've seen on some maps, they were looking at even going to Los Angeles in their
From
proposals.
Vegas.
From Vegas. So, early on, even though they started at the LVCVA, they saw an opportunity to expand much farther than that. And over the next couple of years, they began getting approvals from the county and from the city. I think one of the reasons potentially some people maybe didn't hear about those approvals is because when they went to the county, the agenda item, if you read the agenda item before the county, you wouldn't know that this was about the Boring Company. They came to the county zoning meetings with an agenda item that looked like, has I wish I had a good example right now, but, has something unrelated to the Boring Company and ends with LLC.
It's called like Circus LLC.
Yeah,
or like
exactly.
Downtown Hotel Owner LLC. And that's how they're getting these like various extensions approved, right? So they won the bid with the LVCVA and they started building what we have now, which is a circle around the convention center with underground tunnels with Teslas in it that also connects to Resorts World. Looking at this major map that connects the airport all the way to City Hall with 104 stations makes me wonder why we can't just have a subway system, but I digress. So what are some of the various things that the Boring Company has been hit with? It's not always fines, but certainly there's been various violations.
Yeah, so David mentioned a couple of things. He mentioned the labor violations, which have been reported on, and Fortune and Bloomberg did really incredible work on some of those labor violations.
Right, the OSHA, where people are actually getting burned from water and muck that had chemical accelerants in it, correct?
Exactly. He also mentioned the commercial center dumping, but we found some additional violations. Basically, their permits to discharge industrial wastewater. So when you're building in Las Vegas or really anywhere in Nevada, you're required to get permits from the state or from local jurisdictions to discharge into storm drains or the sewer. And we found just a number of violations where they discharged without the proper permit, or in violation of the permit that they had. We found, and this hadn't been reported before to our knowledge, that they actually entered into a agreement with state environmental regulators and agreed to pay a $90,000 fine after they were cited for discharging without a permit. So we found all sorts of violations like this. And I think one of my takeaways, and I don't know if David agrees, is just the way that some of these are siloed, and a lot of these agencies aren't talking to each other. So it is sort of just, for lack of a better term, kind of a chaotic permitting system that they're under. And like you said, there's no kind of overarching environmental review. There's no kind of proactive look at the impact that both the construction, but then also the operation and maintenance of the Boring Company and what it will mean for for Las Vegas.
So at this point, the public has had no say in this project. Is that accurate?
Little to none, and very little notice, I think, is the bigger issue. Look, there have been times when these agenda items have come up and it's a little obvious what's happening, and people might go to a public comment of a UNLV Board of Regents meeting where they were talking about UNLV lands, or an LVCVA meeting where it came up and there was discussion, and not always, bright and cheery discussion. But for the most part, I think to the point of the story and Daniel's reporting is that a project of this scope and nature would have its own sort of ecosystem of public commentary and input and studies. And all that did not happen in this case because it's a private entity being given essentially the underground right of way to do whatever they feel is appropriate within the constraints of the laws as they exist, but not necessarily the laws that exist applying to this particular project. So that's wherein the chaos occurs.
So coming back to regulation, too, federal, state, city, does Musk see the EPA, OSHA, and other regulatory bodies as the enemy?
I would defer to his tweets on X as to whether or not he deems any regulation to be appropriate or any fine too big that he couldn't just pay his way out of it. So, I mean, that's something that he has pontificated a lot about. And if he were to come on this podcast, I'm sure he would double, triple down.
There have been a series of violations with various government agencies. How were these violations handled, both by those agencies, and what was the response from Boring?
Yeah, so I would say that none of the fines that we have uncovered have exceeded more than, I think the OSHA fine was a little bit more than $100,000, but all of the other fines and penalties that we have found have been in a much smaller range, with the exception of the NDEP, or the Nevada Division of Environmental Protection fine, which was about $90,000. We even found in one case a Clark County Water Quality Compliance Manager actually wrote to Clark County Public Works and asked if they would consider revoking some of Boring's permits because he didn't believe fines would be effective for a company that has the type of resources that Boring has.
What's the point of finding them? They'll just pay it.
Yeah. I mean, Sarah, let me add on to that. There was a Boring contractor who was hauling away some of the materials for, ultimate storage. Apparently, it wasn't secure on that truck, and it spilled onto the I-15, closing it down for multiple hours.
Multiple lanes, yeah.
We were able to confirm that it went back to the Boring company through our research, and the whole fine that the company got was $75.
Why is this report with ProPublica on the Boring Company important to Las Vegans? Like, what impact will this have on our daily lives?
There's a lot of ways to answer that. I think one of the first things that comes to mind is that this is being pitched as the only viable traffic solution for the Las Vegas Strip and some of the most congested areas of the city. And the people that I have talked to have questioned the validity of that statement, which has come from the Las Vegas Convention and Visitors Authority, the LVCVA, that this is the only viable option. I spoke to the Sierra Club, and they basically said, look, we toured the Boring Company. It was cool. It was beautiful. It was sleek. It was very Vegas, lots of neon, but it was not mass transit. And so I think their concern is that this is an opportunity cost that kind of sucks all the oxygen out of the conversation about what could be a really, viable way of moving people from some of these busy places like the airport or like Allegiant Stadium.
David, what do you think?
It's really about the transparency. I completely agree with Daniel that it has derailed a lot of conversations about other viable actual mass transits, because at the end of the day, this is just a bunch of cars driven by drivers who can take 2 or 3 people at a time, 35 miles an hour, through a closed loop system that was presented in a way. Look, first of all, this was presented to the Las Vegas Convention and Visitors Authority. This is a marketing entity. I think a lot of people who we talk to in high positions that show up in the article are like, look, if it's something that helps relieve some of the congestion in our city, okay, as long as it's not costing our agency a lot of money. But by the same token, and that's fine, but by the same token, the way that it's being presented by marketers, not by engineers per se. And so I think that the ordinary Las Vegas citizens should be concerned about what's happening under our city, what the impact of that is, and if this means that, mass transit for the next 20 or 30 years isn't going to happen because we have some cars that can drive you in narrow tunnels with cool lights from the convention center to the airport to, UNLV or a hotel.
I think, we heard questions raised about what the oversight looks like, because this is a privately funded transit system that, a lot of writers, I spoke to a UNLV professor, a public policy expert, and he made the point that there's going to be an expectation that people are riding public transit.
Right.
Many people might not know that this is a private system, and that it's the Boring Company that is responsible for the safe operation of the system. It's not a transportation agency. And
it's not the New York subway.
Right. It's not the New York subway. And so I think that raises just questions moving forward. Of course, we didn't really focus on that as much in our story because we're looking at the 5 miles that have been built. But once the system gets even more complex, and there's potentially 68 miles that are built, I think there are some questions about what the oversight looks like and
Right.
how Boring is going to operate this, in a safe and sustainable way.
And look, I think there are broader implications for all Americans. Given Musk's role advising Trump on ways to slash regulations and government oversight, Boring and the Vegas Loop might actually be like a harbinger for the country.
So the head of the Las Vegas Convention and Visitors Authority, Steve Hill, is a big character in this piece. What is the LVCVA's relationship with the Boring Company and with Musk?
Yeah, I'm going to let Daniel speak to the old relationship. I'm just going to say, LVCVA is the public arm of our marketing for our city. And, under Steve Hill, they've definitely expanded that role in ways that I think predecessors had not with a lot of different projects. But that relationship with Steve Hill and Elon Musk goes back further than the Boring Company, right, Daniel?
Yeah. Daniel, what's the history there?
Yeah, so the relationship between Steve Hill and Elon Musk dates back to about 2014. Before Steve Hill was working for the LVCVA or running the LVCVA, Steve Hill was the head of former Governor Brian Sandoval's Office of Economic Development. And probably the biggest deal that office made was bringing the Tesla Gigafactory to Nevada. Nevada gave, I believe, about an incentive package worth about $1.25 billion. So Hill and Musk and their teams got to know each other through that process. So flash forward to 2018, and now Hill is at the LVCVA. And the LVCVA is looking to build a people mover for its convention center campus. The Boring Company was one of the companies that bid on that proposal. Their proposal came in much lower than other competitors. And ultimately, the LVCVA chose to move forward with the Boring Company for its people mover. What's interesting is that since then, of course, as our story lays out, the Boring Company has been approved to build far beyond the LVCVA, about 68 miles throughout Las Vegas and Clark County. And Steve Hill has been kind of a de facto spokesperson for this project, making the case for this project in front of different boards, making the case for this project in the community, in the news. And he has been very adamant that this is the only viable transit solution for the tourist corridor to relieve congestion. And when I asked him, he acknowledged that people poke at this project a lot, but he said it's a bet that he is completely willing to take, and he has stood by it.
Why did Steve Hill say he favored the Boring Company over all other forms of public transportation?
Yeah, he said similar types of transit that would have the capacity that the Boring Company says that it will have would cost billions and billions of dollars, whereas the Boring Company outside of the convention center is being funded privately. So, I think cost is a major reason. And, I think in the past there's been struggle getting the casino properties, the big powerful players, to back alternative transit modes like light rail on the Strip or something like that.
Okay, so if mass transit was never going to happen, should Steve Hill get some credit for getting something done?
I think that it's worth scrutinizing this project while also looking at the vacuum that created the conditions for the Boring Company to come in and quickly get approvals. The reality is that we haven't seen the public investments in Las Vegas in mass transit that maybe other cities have seen. And I think that's created a vacuum for a private project to sort of come in. I mean, the city and county desperately need congestion relief in these heavily crowded areas. And, I think that for politicians seeing, that this wasn't going to cost public money, at least directly, and that this was a solution on the table in front of them was enough to get their vote.
David, we did talk to some stakeholders in this whole situation. Who do we talk to, and what were some of the highlights from those conversations?
Yeah, here on CityCast, we definitely talked with people who are affected by this project. We talked with the mayoral candidates. We talked with Mayor Goodman, who at one point was the main dissenting voice about sort of giving carte blanche to the Boring Tunnel project. Didn't think that it was particularly useful or safe or effective from her words, and she told us that. We talked with the new mayoral candidate coming in, Shelley Berkeley. We, on CityCast, have talked to the head of the airport, Rosemary Vasiliadis, and the head of the RTC, MJ Maynard. I think that the overwhelming thing that we kind of gleaned from all the people that we talked about, just if I could generalize, is that, the hotels don't necessarily want to be left behind. If this is a viable way of connecting people directly from hotels to the airport and back. And so if they're the ones that are building the stations per se, and it's not costing additional taxpayer money, they're all for whatever will help.
I would add one thing, too, to that from David's interview that I found really illuminating with former Mayor Goodman, which is that, she, both in the media and at LVCVA, had been kind of a critical voice in this conversation. She had raised a lot of concerns about the Boring Company and questions about the Boring Company. Ultimately, she voted to approve the Boring Company's expansion in Las Vegas City Council. And David asked her about that vote. And I found it really illuminating what she said, which was basically none of our business partners, I think is the term she used, or something to that effect, wanted to be left behind. There was sort of this FOMO, this fear of missing out. If the Boring Company was going to connect to the airport, nobody wanted to miss out on that connection to this really important artery, right, for visitors coming to Las Vegas. And I think that was a really illuminating example of how the power dynamic has worked and how kind of power has played out and has shaped the configuration of this project.
So I would love to come to each of you with this as well. What surprised you the most as you looked into the Las Vegas Loop project?
What surprised me the most was the scope of the project, no question. I think that I knew that the Boring Company was planning to go to Allegiant. I knew that it was planning to go to most of the Strip properties. I did not know that it had been approved for 68 miles. That is a really large size transit system that is complex and requires a lot of organization. I don't myself know of any other privately funded projects that are that large in kind of a complicated urban setting that are not operated by or in conjunction with a public transportation agency.
I was surprised about a number of things through this reporting. Number one, that based on the scope of this project that there wasn't a requirement of town hall meetings or the type of things we see with any other transport project. I think the second thing I was most surprised at was that when they initially went to the county, and the county comes up, every business gets licensed, of course. I mean, that's how the world works, because we want to have safety and security and thoughtfulness when we're doing projects of any sort. And the best license that they could come up with was an amusement ride transportation license, which is the same license that's given to the high roller. But even with that, it just nothing really seemed to fit correctly. I think the third thing that I was really most surprised at was that there's this constant narrative that this is all private. It's not costing taxpayers anything. There's no public funds involved. But we did find bonding contracts and agreements for the LVCVA to the tune of over $50 million from our public entity for the building and operation of the Las Vegas Loop. And so that narrative, is being massaged in a way that makes it sound like the public isn't involved at all, but there is that public involvement. And look, to the credit of the various government entities, it's not like they're doing it without any oversight, without any regulations. That is not true. But because of the way that it's sort of fractionalized, there's not enough communication between the various agencies to make a comprehensive plan. And I think that was really surprising to me, especially given, again, the foot in the door was just the convention center, but now the scope is beyond, way beyond.
So what is still unanswered in this story? Daniel, what do you still want to know?
I would like to know exactly what the Boring Company's plans are, where they plan to go next, and exactly how they plan to phase this construction. I would also like to know just generally where Las Vegas fits into the Boring Company's plans overall, where they might go next, and that sort of thing.
David?
I would like to know what the 10-year impact of all these tunnels are underneath our city. And I would like to see a study from geologists and engineers as to what the long-term impact of having these tunnels in an environment like ours is. I'd also like to know, honestly, I'd like to answer the question, what's in the dirt that's being spilled over trucks and cars on city roads? But we don't know.
I would love to see a ridership study. I want to know if this is actually effective at moving people around, and if people like this and want this as their form of private public transportation.
Let me add one more thing really quick, Sarah. I want to know if they really care about getting people around Las Vegas, or if this is just a test run for underground tunnels up on Mars. It seems like a lot of these Musk companies if you put them all together, SpaceLink and rockets that you could reuse and underground transportation systems, if we're all just being guinea pigs for an ultimate rehabilitation of human life on Mars. That's my big question.
Okay, David, we will end on that joke. Thank you so much, David. Thank you so much, Daniel. I am really excited to read this article. And just thank you for being here on CityCast Las Vegas today.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you.
Make sure to read the full story online for all of the details. We're going to link to the article in the show notes. And if you love what you're hearing, go subscribe to our podcast. We publish episodes every day about the politics, culture, food, and history of Las Vegas. Not in Vegas? We've got podcasts in 12 sister cities from Portland to D.C. That's all for today here in CityCast Las Vegas. Thank you for listening. Now, go tell a friend, rate the show, leave us a review, and subscribe to our morning newsletter. We'll be back tomorrow morning with more news from around the city. Take care.